So we're going to talk a little bit about compliance in the cloud right now. So compliance basically is meeting some sort of compliance, regulatory, governance framework, and being sure that your infrastructure, your systems, your applications actually meet the controls that are laid out. John, I'll start with you real quick. As far as fundamentals of automation and cloud computing, what is infrastructure as code first? And then what advantages do you see with companies helping maintain their compliance in the cloud?
I don't think it's any mystery to anyone that process is absolutely critical whenever you have a situation where there is a lot of value on the line. In other words, like if we're talking about the airline industry, if we're talking about medicine, if we're talking about anywhere that there's risk, process is really important, and following that process in order to ensure that you don't make mistakes. This is how you avoid disaster. And so that is a natural progression into cloud computing, because really what we're talking about with infrastructure as code is we're saying, what if we were to put into code these processes? What if we were to describe the infrastructure meaning the layout of the network, the various resources, how are they configured, how are they connected? What if we were to codify all of that into literally a common language of some kind? And then in that way, we could ensure that we had a repeatable process, we didn't have mistakes, we understood exactly how things were connected and laid out, where things could be reviewed by multiple people. And in this way, you really are ensuring a number of different things. You're ensuring that you can have a repeatable way of achieving the same result. You're ensuring that the security of the environment is understood and can be reviewed. And you're ensuring that there isn't any common, we're humans, we make mistakes. There isn't a common human mistake made somewhere along the way. So that's really the idea behind infrastructure as code. It's just the idea of codifying what you would naturally do with your own two hands, but trying to remove that human process of making mistakes and trying to make it more of a codified process. Maybe a little long-winded, but yeah, that's how I would define IaC.
And using IaC will give you a lot of advantages when you start getting into configuration management, proving that your devices are actually configured the same, because as opposed to people manually going in and making changes, if you can prove that all your code, everything you've done in the cloud is done infrastructure as code, meaning the only changes made to your environment is done through code that you can actually audit and review, you can actually show that you have solid configuration management. So if you spin up a virtual machine, you can be sure that it's a hardened virtual machine. If you spin up any sort of network security control, those controls are in place. If you start bringing up clusters, any sort of Kubernetes containerized systems, you can show that you have controls in place because it's actually in the code. So you can do what we call continuous integration, continuous delivery, CI/CD, where you can actually push out changes. And a lot of companies will actually push out changes many times a day just because everything's automated. They'll obviously test it in a non-production environment. But because of this automation, they're able to push out code frequently, move very rapidly. They're able to scale. They're able to actually reduce compliance burden as well by using some higher level services. So as opposed to using infrastructure as a service, IaaS, where you spin up everything, you spin all your servers up, you can actually use serverless environments where you don't even maintain the server. What are the advantages that you see with using serverless or shifting some of this compliance burden to your cloud provider?
I think everybody loves it when, forgive me, but it's great when you could say that's somebody else's problem. In other words, like, hey, that's somebody else's thing to worry about. It's their job to worry about the compliance, the security, the upkeep, this sort of thing. It's the whole reason that cloud became popular, is because people realized, hey, if we can capitalize on speed and we can ensure that somebody like Amazon or somebody like Google or somebody like Microsoft has to actually fix and take care of and maintain and secure the data center, then we don't have to have that. We don't have to worry about whether or not a hard drive went out at 2 a.m. So we're shifting the burden to them. We're saying, you guys can maintain the DC. You guys can watch the failure on the NAS or whatever it is. You guys can worry about the VLANs and what switching equipment needs to be changed this year. Don't have to worry about any of that. So this is the benefit of serverless as well. The idea is with serverless, all you're doing is you're abstracting one more layer up. And by abstracting, I'm saying, if you're talking about a bare metal machine, because we used to actually have blades in racks, in servers server rooms back in the day, talking about a bare metal machine, then I had to sit there and worry about the OS and the patching and everything else. Maybe we then move to something that's one abstraction higher. We move to something like a hypervisor, let's say. So now we can start worrying about clusters of machines. We start spreading our failure over many machines. We stop worrying about one box failing, and now we don't have to worry so much. And so maybe we abstract one layer above that again, and we start talking about serverless. No, of course, there really is a server still underneath. But the point is we no longer have to be worried so much with that underlying system. So to answer this finally here at the end, we are able to shift all of the concern around compliance, configuration, upkeep, and everything else to the provider. And the provider gives us certain allowances and assurances that say we will maintain a certain readiness of security, state, and compliance around these services, which means that we are no longer burdened by having to upkeep those. We can now just simply worry about the security of our application, the security of our configuration, but we no longer have to worry about things like the security of the underlying operating system, for example, or the patching or whatever else is necessary. It depends, of course, on your alignments with what service you're using. So read into the service you're using and what's brought about by that provider. But other than that, it's great. Serverless is the way to go. If I could suggest going full serverless for compliance reasons, I would say go full serverless. Go absolutely. It is the best thing for you. Make it their problem. Don't make it your problem. Make it their problem. It's awesome.
That's a great point. And every cloud provider, all the major ones, so you have AWS, Azure, GCP, you have Oracle, they all have compliance programs and they maintain compliance. So I'll just bring up PCI, I'll bring up FedRAMP, two different frameworks that are out there that you would have to meet. Both of those are generally provided to you by your cloud provider. They will show that, yes, this service that you're using in our cloud meets FedRAMP moderate, meets FedRAMP high. It actually meets PCI DSS. And then you can inherit those controls when you go in and say, and we'll use PCI as an example. You have to harden your operating system in PCI. If you actually spin up your own VMs, you then have to be sure that your virtual machines have hardening. If you actually use serverless, that burden, as John said, is now on the cloud provider to maintain the operating system. They will provide you with evidence that they meet PCI compliance, and you will be able to inherit the controls there and not have to maintain the operating system. So it's one of the great advantages of using a cloud provider is you're shifting the burden of compliance somewhere else on there. You still have to maintain, there's parts of it you do have to maintain, your access controls, how you set up the application, how you're actually programming, how you're doing security checks, you're monitoring. You're still going to have to do that, but you can move some of the burden away. So we talked about the fundamentals of automation in the cloud and how you can actually shift some of the burden from the cloud onto the cloud provider, if you said that correctly. Now, Shannon, I want to talk a little bit about the automation. Can you kind of just run through at a high level, because I know you work with RegScale, which is a GRC tool. From a high level, how are you seeing how automation is being used to meet these compliance burdens?
I think what we're seeing from a compliance standpoint is some of these compliance frameworks or requirements that we have to meet were originally designed with good intent, but quite some time ago, right? The original HIPAA requirement was first developed in 1993 and it was last updated in the early 2000s, right? So some of the time, what was written back in day with good intent is really hard to actually maintain unless you automate it or put that burden on somebody else. And so I think that's where automation is really key here, from being able to grab the data that needs to be done from a reporting standpoint, and being able to grab that automatically and put that in documentation, and just that reporting aspect that's going to be needed from a compliance standpoint. If you don't automate it, you probably won't be able to achieve it manually at this rate, especially with environments where you're spinning things up and down potentially on a daily basis. And we don't want to ever hinder progress with compliance needs. So automation is going to be key to be able to enable that. The other thing that you see is that, yeah, we've put a lot of the responsibility of managing that on our cloud providers and everything, but it's still our responsibility to be able to report on that. So you have to still be able to grab the data from those organizations and put it into frames and terms so that you can report to your regulator. Yes, we have also, not only are we utilizing them, but we've verified that they are doing the right things. And so it comes to doing that partnership with your third-party providers to make sure that you've gathered it, that their automation is reporting appropriately for you, so that you can report appropriately to your regulator, because at the end of the day, it is still your responsibility compliance. Even if you are putting some of that onus on your third party, you are still responsible for that compliance piece. So I think really there is no other way moving forward unless you find some way to automate. And what we're seeing from a GRC platform is, how do we turn this into like compliance in the way that security has been automating their response? What lessons can we learn from the security field? My field previous to this was cybersecurity specifically, and there's been so many advancements in being able to prevent and detect and respond. So how do we take that prevention, detection, and response automation that we see in the cybersecurity space and apply it to the compliance space, so we can, fast track our progress, right? And so what we're starting to see is SOAR-like response in the compliance space, and being able to grab that automation where we can and apply it. So it's really exciting to see, from that cybersecurity space, those lessons learned, and so we can apply them smartly to the compliance space, because they're not the same. Compliance is not security. Security is not compliance. They're not one and the same. But I think we can learn the same lessons from one another, to be able to progress forward, to make sure that technology is continuing to develop at the rate that we're moving at.
What, Shannon, are you seeing as far as bringing these controls into a tool like RegScale or any other GRC tool, and using automation to remove a lot of the compliance burden of doing all these checks manually?
So some of our clients, or a lot of our clients, have multiple different technologies that they're utilizing to do certain scans in their environment, because you've got your network, you've got your infrastructure, you've got your code scanners, right? And some of those players see each other as competitors, and so they do things uniquely to one another. And in a similar way to ASEAM, what we're working towards as an organization is creating some type of single pane of glass, using standards that are recognized by the industry to take all of that data and organize it in a way that you can report across all of your scanners, to say all of these are working in conjunction with one another to protect our environment from a security standpoint, but then also allow you to report in a congruous way, to say, okay, yes, they are also meeting all of our compliance requirements. And so that's what we're seeing, especially on that continuous monitoring piece that's required from a FedRAMP standpoint, to be able to take all of your different scanners and fill out the paperwork that's necessary to say, these are the issues, from a POEN standpoint, these are the issues that we're finding, these were remediated month over month, and these scans will prove that. Well, how do we take those scan data and then automate that paperwork for our clients? And that's where we're seeing a lot of value from a continuous monitoring standpoint, is say, yeah, point all your scanners at our technology. It will, report all of that the different fields in similar manners, so that you on the back end can make more easiest reports that then get sent into your regulatory body. So that's one key thing from an automation standpoint that we're seeing huge benefits to our clients for, is just being able to do that paperwork, because you're doing all the work from a security standpoint. How do we automate just the reporting side from a compliance standpoint?
Going into the future of artificial intelligence, machine learning, where are you really seeing the opportunities and the benefits in this specific area on meeting your compliance burden and using GRC tools? So Shannon, why don't you go first?
So from my experience, you can use AI to help you fill out your documentation. I think that's going to be key there. Sometimes if you're a newer organization starting out on their compliance journey, just having words on paper, using AI to get words on paper for the first stab is going to be key there. So that's one huge benefit there. Another one is being able to take, if you already have your policy and procedure documentation put together, being able to take that and take the key pieces out of those documents, if you've authored them already, and get them into your compliance documentation, so you're getting the credit there as well. So reading through documentation that already might be available to you is going to be key from an AI standpoint, and just putting words together to submit an honest compliance report. And then the third piece that we're seeing from a value standpoint is using AI to pre-grade you, figure out where you're sitting in your compliance before you submit to your regulators, so that you can have a proactive look and see, okay, is there anything that we could be doing better before we then submit in or go through an audit process. So key things is getting just the initial words on paper, to pulling in documentation and what you already have into your compliance, and then also reviewing where you sit based off of what you already have put together, so that you can be more focused in your efforts. One thing that we're seeing really cool is the ability to report across and then say, okay, if I do this one thing, that will help me across these 5 different regulatory frameworks that I need to report upon. So you're prioritizing your work even smarter with automation and AI too.
A lot of compliance is data entry, and if you can get ML to do that for you, that just reduces a lot of the workload. John, what are your thoughts on AI ML in this space?
Just broadly speaking, I would say there's a lot of, I know this wasn't the direct question, but I have to say this because I hear it so often. There's a lot of concern about what AI is capable of, concerns around what does it mean for various fields. This is just my opinion, but I would say AI is like the invention of power tools, basically. Like if people have been using hammers for forever, it is suddenly like being gifted something like, let's just say a hammer drill or something different. Maybe they've got a power drill now, or maybe they've got a bandsaw now or something different. That doesn't mean that you don't still need somebody who knows what they're doing. It just means that you're reducing a lot of the toil. And so in other words, you don't have so much cumbersome, time burdened, just task saturation where you're just sitting there filling out enormous volumes of paperwork trying to get something done. So to come full circle here, removing the toil of documentation through automation and through AI is phenomenal. Like that is one of the most game-changing things, in my opinion, that's come out of any of this in the last, well, since AI was invented. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I'm saying that personally as well from the perspective of I don't really love documenting my stuff. Like, of course I will document my code, and of course I will, like put notes in my repos and try to explain what things do, and that's all fine. But like, as much of that as can be automated as possible is phenomenal, because again, if I can have a tool that roughs it in, and then if I can review that and with a critical eye, if I can correct where it's made mistakes, my goodness, is that faster than me having to explain the whole thing from scratch. It is like having your own assistant, which is why so many people, I'm sure, use the terms of AI assistant and this kind of thing. So just broadly speaking, Shannon's already covered so many of the core values here. I couldn't help but just go back for a moment and basically just say AI is awesome for that. And that is where I see its greatest value. And I do not see it fully replacing the knowledge and experience of somebody coming in behind and verifying what it has said. I think that will always be necessary. You cannot solely rely upon AI to make decisions. That is irresponsible. So I think that it is a tool, and it brings enormous value to people who are skilled and who don't need to be wasting a ton of time. It's a force multiplier. That's what it is.
Starting with something and editing it is so much easier than starting from nothing. But I fully agree with you. You gotta look through that data and make sure what it's read is actually true to what's happening in your environment, because we aren't at the point where we can fully trust AI. Right?
Well, and I would say you can't even trust humans. I mean, we make mistakes. And so, like, even when you have colleagues, I mean, this is the reason peer-reviewed papers exist in science. You can have PhDs who disagree, and of course they do every day. But the whole point is if you have enough consensus from highly educated or from highly knowledgeable folks around some particular topic, my goodness, like the truth will eventually win out as long as you're following the process. So it is the way. It is absolutely the way. Rough it in, don't waste your time, and then come in with high skilled, well experienced people and just review. And so, yeah, absolutely, totally agree.
I'll agree with that. Staring at a blank piece of paper and making something from scratch versus having at least an outline defined
The worst.
I do write a lot of blogs, and I've gotten to the point where I'll use AI just to give me an idea of an outline structure. And once I have an outline structure, I can spew the words out, but it's amazing. And the same thing when you do FedRAMP. So you do moderate or even high, you can have a system security plan, SSP, that could have 1,200 pages. And it's literally 1,200 pages of written words or documentation, drawings. I would say 600 pages of those are probably able to be started with machine learning or some sort of AI, where they can go in there, they can validate, you can load your policies, you can have it look at all these other tools we talked about, the CNAP tools or even the native cloud tools, and it can start something. There is absolutely no way right now you could pass any sort of audit by just sending in what AI produces. You actually have to go through every single thing it does and just validate it's correct and tweak it. But it gives you a starting point. You're not starting from scratch. Some of them might be completely off. Most of them will have at least some truth in there and give you a starting point. Sometimes you can even go into control after you used any sort of AI tool, and it's looked at stuff you never even thought about. And you could just look at it and say, I guess that makes sense. I never really thought of it that way, but I can meet this control doing it different ways. And so I have seen AI benefit through that aspect where it actually looks at stuff in a different way. I've also seen hallucinations and stuff where it basically makes up answers, which don't make any sense. So as we grow in this AI world, maybe in 10 years, 15 years, it'll be to the point where it needs less of a peer review or rewrite. Right now, it's probably, I would guess, 70% rewrites of what's out there, but it gives you a starting point.
Most frustrating for me is when it makes up various you'll be looking for a particular solution to something, like you're trying to do something inside of some API and it completely makes up some kind of a call that you're like, oh, that would be perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And then you try to use it. You assume perhaps maybe it knows. You try to use it and it's completely made up like an entire functionality that literally doesn't even exist. And you're like, wow, you got me. And you go, you like start searching for this particular method, whatever this is, and it literally doesn't even exist. And you're like, all right, great, that's just perfect. So it's a perfect example of hallucination. It's silly, but that's exactly why you have to have someone verify things. But man, is it useful. It is so nice to be able to rough stuff in. Just got to keep your fingers away from the blades, man. It's funny. Yeah.
It's basically suggesting something that you need, and
Yeah.
this should exist. But
yeah, it's like, I totally agree with you. That's exactly how we should do it. And you're like, yes, I agree. No, it doesn't exist.
John, do you have an overall summary? Any just overall thoughts for us on cloud automation for compliance and meeting those burdens?
Automate everything that you can. Automation is the way in which you're going to achieve less error. You're going to achieve higher agility. You're going to achieve better outcomes for your compliance. Anytime that you can remove a manual process, invest the time and do it. You're going to save yourself such an enormous volume of effort and error and tears down the line. The biggest mistake that I see made is something is good enough for now. Temporary workarounds are not temporary. Bypassing something and just saying, we'll come back to it later, we'll make this different, we'll make this better. For now, let's just make it manual. For now, let's just build it this way. Taking those shortcuts, that is the definition of debt, in my opinion, technical debt. So generally speaking, when it comes to compliance, lean on automation, just do it. You're going to thank yourself later. So
we know that the cloud is our future, and the only way that we're going to be able to achieve compliance, from a reporting standpoint, is to automate that as best as you can. So, I think it's all going to go hand in hand on, as you move forward in the cloud, look for every way that you can automate your compliance piece to that puzzle, because you're not going to be able to scale manually with cloud on your compliance side too.
Once again, automation is the way to go. When you start manual processes, they start building on themselves, and you get to a point where nobody really knows what has happened. And this happens on infrastructure. If you're maintaining your infrastructure through manual, changes. People will not know why certain changes will happen. You may have it in a ticket somewhere that you did, but then you'd have to start researching the last 3 years of tickets to see what has changed. That helps you from a compliance point of view, having automation. It helps you from a disaster recovery point of view. If you need to actually restore what you have in place and you've made a ton of manual changes, you can only restore back to what you have coded, and then you're going to have to regenerate all those manual changes. So automation across the board helps not only in compliance, but helps with the overall running of your environment. And then using a GRC tool is really a best practice once you start getting into any sort of complicated framework. So you could probably get by maybe with a SOC 2 by doing spreadsheets, which is where most people start. But when you start getting into more advanced PCI, ISO 27001, especially FedRAMP or HITRUST or anything like that, CMMC, you really need a tool to pull this in. It becomes a burden that is almost impossible to maintain if you're not using some sort of tool to do this.